Dobar dan. Razgovaramo sa američkom profesorkom Elizabet Skjuz, koja se posebno bavi medijskim izveštavanjem o masovnim tragedijama i žrtvama tih događaja. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
In the first 6 months in America, there was the most mass murders ever. In Serbia, we had 2 horrible tragedies. Public has right to know, needs to know, wants to know, but what are the ethical boundaries of reporting in this situation?
I think there are ethical guidelines that need to be followed, things that we've learned over decades of mass shootings in the United States that we think are best practices. The boundaries are up for each newsroom, each journalist to decide, but there are things that we know will harm victims in terms of coverage, and if it serves a real public right to know or need to know, you may feel like you have to report something. Things like, but we know there are things that don't serve the public right to know or need to know. The public really doesn't need to see the shooter's face on the front page of a paper all the time. Probably doesn't need to see the shooter's face at all, because that doesn't help explain things. And seeing the shooter is something that just adds to the personal grief that a victim might feel. So things like that, using a shooter's name, trying to explain the shooter's motive, which is usually not understandable at all unless, some psychologist or something starts to really unpack what a shooter might have written. So all of that shooter-focused coverage, generally speaking, is not helpful to victims, and it doesn't really inform the public all that much more. So there's no need to do it.
You have, during your visit, you have met with media representatives, with journalists. What have you identified as the main problems and challenges in reporting in violent crimes and in general?
Some of the main challenges, I think, are the challenges that journalists sometimes feel the need to be really first to get the information out. In some instances, that's absolutely a need. In some cases, it's just journalistic pride, and maybe we need to set that aside. There's also, tied with that, is a challenge from social media. So social media can get information out almost as fast as somebody can pull their phone out of their pocket and type something into Twitter, or X, I think it's now called. But I think there is a way in which journalism, and by that I mean kind of people who are trained and people who are trying to do good work, need to set that aside, because being accurate and being thorough is more important than being first when it comes to trauma reporting. You need to slow it down a little bit so that you can give yourself time to think about what might be in the best interest of the public and victims and the communities that are suffering. How do you do reporting that is solutions oriented rather than just salacious?
A couple months ago, we had a visit from UN reporter on freedom of expression and opinion, and she described public discourse here as toxic. How to report mass shootings and violent crimes in this atmosphere?
Well, it depends on where the toxicity is coming from. I can say that in the US media, some of the real challenges come from a polarized media, where you've got some news organizations that are situated firmly on the right side of politics, political right, and some that are on the political left. And that can lead to a lot of noise, I think, and confusion for the public. So I think if that's the kind of toxicity we're talking about, responsible news organizations can take these stories and say that we're going to leave the politics aside and instead focus on what kinds of systemic problems there might be that make mass shootings possible. And in the United States, that coverage is very important because we continue to have mass shootings. I would hope that for Serbia that isn't the case. But understanding what we need to do to make schools safer, what we need to do to make workplaces safer, what we need to do about gun laws, what we need to do about mental health and providing better mental health facilities and options for people, all of that in addition to a myriad of other things. But those are sort of some of the top line things that we need to be able to talk about without it being immediately politicized into, again, Republican right, Democratic left in the United States, or just kind of people retreating into their own camps, if you will.
But how much politics influence the way media report on these crimes, or the crimes in general?
In the U.S. at least, politics, I think, influences a lot how we talk about gun control and gun laws, and because that's a hotbed political issue. It's also complicated by the fact that our groups like the National Rifle Association have a lot of funds that they put into lobbying and helping support candidates who run for office, which means those candidates are very reluctant to do anything about modifying gun laws in the United States. Our Supreme Court has become more politicized. And back to your earlier question, I think a lot of that is tied to social media, which is, pulling people apart rather than bringing them together.
What is your impression of when reporting in Serbia regarding this issue and involvement of politics in it?
I don't have as strong an impression. I do think from what I've learned that the politicians in Serbia who maybe were talking pretty freely about the shooter and providing information, I don't know if that's an appropriate role for a political leader. I think that politicians really need to, in a time of a mass shooting, need to become people who can speak to the public and can try to help calm the public mind. Talk about the fact that we grieve the lives lost, but don't talk about the shooter. Again, don't spotlight the shooter. The shooter doesn't matter. How the shooter did what the shooter did, what we can do to maybe prevent the next one, how we can honor and recognize the victims and the survivors, that all matters. The shooter is unimportant in many ways.
In media, we also have a lot of hate speech. We have violence in different ways presented on TV stations. How the media should behave in this environment, and how to avoid this being presented to the public?
Hate speech is pretty toxic. I mean, if we're talking about toxicity, I would say, if we're talking journalistic environments, it's easy to recognize people who will do that. If you've seen them interviewed anyplace else, kind of that these are people who spew hate. Don't invite them on your programs. Don't give them air, if you will. They may be in social media places. They may write columns, but news organizations don't have to run their stuff. They don't even have to, again, they can write about them maybe, but write about them in the fact that they are causing issues, that they are toxic people who are hurting the public conversation instead of enhancing it. Don't give them the space, right? To the degree that you can.
We also have one specific when it comes to ethnic background of the victim, and therefore a lot of mainstream media is acting if the victim is one of ours, we're going to be especially considerate and report on it. What is the solution with that kind of behavior?
Well, I think if not all victims are going to want to speak, of course, but I think it is important to give space, time, whatever, to any victim who wants to tell the story of their experience or of their loved one. Ultimately, we're all members of the same community. The community that was traumatized was made up of people of different ethnicities, and favoring one over the other starts to differentiate them in ways that is not helpful. So I would hope that journalists would keep in mind that anybody who is a victim of a mass shooting or any other trauma, regardless of whether they share your ethnicity or not, deserves the same kind of attention as anybody else.
What would be your recommendation to journalists and also to the public regarding what journalists should do, how to report, and what public should expect from journalists, and what's the line of privacy? This is not something you should read about it.
So I can speak for what journalists should do. So journalists should, again, highlight victims, not shooters. Journalists should look at processes, flaws in the system, because that can help the public. When journalists want to speak with victims, they really need to give victims a lot of agency, a lot of control over the narrative. Somebody who is a victim is, again, traumatized, in pain, and if they're willing to share that pain with you and share their heart, their story with you, you owe it to them to let them tell the story in a way that makes sense for them. So letting them have a lot of control over the story and how it gets told is important. Also understanding that people who are in trauma have our brains process memories differently in times of trauma, and that they need to be free to just kind of tell what they remember, rather than being, you're not doing a police interrogation, you don't need to know, oh, what happened then, and what did the shooter say, and just ask them what they remember. Just ask them what they were sensing at the time, what they might have heard, if there were any other sensory kind of things, smells, touch, right? All of that can lead to a really good interview for the journalist, because what you're getting is more accurate recall, but also for the victim, because you're not trying to get them to remember things that in that moment their brain is blocking. They can't remember because their brain is trying to protect them from something. And so as the journalist, you shouldn't push them into a place where they're not comfortable.
Thank you very much for this conversation. Your expertise is also on the election process, and maybe we can continue next time on this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bio je ovo razgovor sa profesorkom Elizabet Skjuz sa Univerziteta u Koloradu.